I like to summarize the evidence using 4 words that begin with the letter E. The first E stands for execution. Was Jesus dead after being crucified? And the answer is absolutely yes. There is no record anywhere of anybody ever surviving a full Roman crucifixion. Even the Journal of the American Medical Association, which is a secular, peer-reviewed, scientific medical journal, carried an investigation into the medical and historical evidence for the death of Jesus and said, there's a quote, clearly the weight of the historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead even before the wound to his side was inflicted. We've got, you could go to an atheist New Testament scholar like Gerd Ludemann, formerly of Vanderbilt, and he'll tell you Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable, indisputable. And one of the reasons I found that it's so universally agreed by historians that he was dead after being crucified, when you study ancient history, we're lucky if we have 1 or 2 sources to confirm a fact. But for the death of Jesus, we not only have multiple early first century accounts in the documents of the New Testament, we've also got 5 ancient sources outside the Bible confirming and corroborating that he died. Josephus, first century Jewish historian who worked for the Romans, Tacitus, another early historian, Mirabar Serapion, Lucian, even the Jewish Talmud admits he was dead. So the first E is execution, Jesus was dead. Second E is the most interesting, stands for early. We have early accounts or early reports that Jesus rose from the dead. In other words, reports that go right back to the beginning. Why is that important? So I used to think, like a lot of skeptics, that the resurrection was a legend. And I knew it took time for legend to develop in the ancient world, so I figured, 100, 150 years after the death of Jesus, legends developed, mythologies were spun, stories were invented, and that's where the idea of the resurrection came from. But what I learned, and I've continued this investigation to the present day, I continue to look into this. What I've learned, I think, decimates the claim that the resurrection is a legend. And here's why. We have preserved for us a creed of the earliest Christians. A creed, a statement of conviction based on eyewitness accounts that the earliest Christians, right there in the first century, would rally around based on facts that they knew to be true. So this creed contains the essence of Christianity. It says Jesus died. Why? For our sins. He was buried. On the 3rd day, he rose from the dead, and then it mentions the specific names of eyewitnesses and groups of eyewitnesses to whom he appeared, including 500 people at once. And then it says parenthetically, by the way, a lot of those folks are still around. So if you don't believe me, go ask them. Go ahead and talk to them yourself. Right. If they're around, you can question them. Now, this creed has been dated back by scholars to within months of the death of Jesus. How do we know? Well, the Apostle Paul preserved it for us. He wrote a letter to the church in Corinth about 21 to 25 years after the death of Jesus. He recounts this creed, and he indicates past tense. I already gave you this creed earlier. So let's say within 20 years, he had given this creed to the church in Corinth. We could stop there, and that would be very impressive when you consider the first 2 biographies of Alexander the Great by Arrian and Plutarch written 400 years after his life, and they're generally considered reliable. So within 20 years is really good, but we can go back earlier because we know that Paul used to be Saul of Tarsus, a persecutor, a hater of Christians. 1 to 3 years after the death of Jesus, he's on the road to Damascus. Boom, he has this encounter with the risen Christ. He becomes the Apostle Paul. Immediately, he goes into Damascus and he meets with some apostles. Now, many scholars believe this is when he was given the creed that he later writes in the letter. But others say, wait, it may have been 3 years later. 3 years later, Paul goes to Jerusalem and he meets for 15 days with 2 eyewitnesses to the resurrection who are specifically named in the creed, Peter and James. And the Greek word that Paul uses in Galatians to describe this meeting suggests that this was an investigative inquiry. They were checking each other out. What do you know? What did you see? What do you experience? And some scholars believe this is when he was given the creed by 2 people specifically named in the creed. Wow. But either way, this means within 1 to 6 years after the death of Jesus, this creed is already in existence, and therefore the beliefs that make up that creed go back earlier virtually to the cross itself. In fact, probably the greatest scholar in this area, Dr. James D.G. Dunn, says, this is a quote, he says, this tradition, by that he means this creed, we can be entirely confident was formulated as a creed, as tradition, within months of the death of Jesus, within months. That is far too quick to write it off as a legend. In fact, one of the greatest classical historians who ever lived was A.N. Sherwin White of Oxford. He understood the rate at which legend developed in the ancient world, and he said the passage of 2 generations of time is not even enough for legend to grow up and wipe out a solid core of historical truth. we don't have 2 generations of time passing here. We got a news flash.
Right.
And news flash, it goes right back to the beginning. So we have early, and we've got other early accounts right from the first century in Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the book of Acts, and so forth. So Jesus was dead, execution, early accounts, which I believe discounts the possibility this is a legend. Third E is for empty tomb. And there's lots of reasons why we believe the tomb is empty, but I think the most convincing reason is that even the opponents of Jesus implicitly admitted that it was empty. How do we know? Well, because when the disciples began proclaiming that Jesus had risen, what the opponents of Jesus said, we know there's some sources inside and outside the New Testament, that what the opponents said was, so, disciples, Jesus is risen. Opponents, oh, well, the disciples stole the body.
Yeah.
Now, think about that. That's a cover story. They're implicitly admitting the tomb is empty. They're trying to explain how it got empty.
Right.
It's like if you're a student, I mean a teacher, and a student comes up to you and says, the dog ate my homework. That student's admitting, look, I don't have my homework, but I can explain what happened to it. The dog ate it. It's the same thing. So everybody's admitting the tomb is empty. That's not the issue. The issue is, how did it get empty? And then the fourth E stands for eyewitnesses. Not only was Jesus' tomb discovered empty, but over a period of time, he appears alive in a dozen different instances to more than 515 people, to skeptics and doubters, to men, to women, to groups, to individuals, indoors, outdoors, daytime, nighttime. The disciples talked to him. They ate with them. They touched him. But here's what's interesting about the eyewitnesses. Remember I said earlier, in ancient history, we're lucky if we have 1 or 2 sources to confirm a fact. Well, for the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the resurrected Jesus, we have no fewer than 9 ancient sources, inside and outside the New Testament, confirming and corroborating the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the resurrected Jesus. That is an avalanche.
That doesn't happen. I gather at one recent debate on this, someone brought in a nurse who had said, listen, you've been in hospitals, you've seen people die, have they ever come back? And so on. And so how do you respond to the initial skepticism that someone may have of, how could that possibly be?
Well, the first thing to say is that people in the first century knew just as well as we do that dead people don't come back. If you read from Homer through Socrates to Plato to Pliny, whenever they mention the possibility of resurrection, they say, come on, as you say, give me a break. We know that doesn't. And the early Christians knew that just as well as we do. This is, again, part of this chronological snobbery thing. And this is a C.S. Lewis line about that. He says, people often imagine that the ancients didn't know the laws of nature and that we now that we have modern science, we do. And he said, apropos the virgin birth, the reason that Joseph was worried about Mary's pregnancy was not because he didn't know where babies came from, but because he did. And the same with the resurrection. The disciples were not going around saying, oh, well, isn't that interesting? So people sometimes come back from the dead. No, this was not one instance of what now appeared to be a new possible general rule or something. Far from it. Rather, and this is a place where people often get confused. As people say, oh, well, the Jews believed in resurrection, so when Jesus died, they naturally thought he'd come back. Well, no, some Jews, most Jews of the time, did believe in resurrection, but resurrection, they believed, was something that God would do for all his people at the end of time. Nobody ever imagined it would happen for one person in the middle. And you can test this because we know 100 years either side of Jesus, we know of several Jewish resistance movements, messianic movements, rebel movements. Routinely they ended with the death of the founder, and we have in the histories of Josephus and so on accounts of what happened next. If the man you followed, who you believe is the king, the new leader, the one God has sent, etc., if he gets killed, you have a choice. Either you give up the movement or you get yourself another leader. And we've got evidence of movements that do one or other of those things. And in particular, the idea of choosing another leader, the leader of the church in Jerusalem throughout the next generation was James, who was Jesus' own brother. Now, it's very interesting because he was a great leader, a great teacher, a wonderful man of prayer, etc. But nobody ever said that James was the Messiah. If Jesus' body had stayed in the tomb, that would have been the natural thing. Well, it wasn't Jesus, too bad, but here's his brother. He's a great teacher. We revere him. And he was the man who was physically closest to this Jesus who sadly got crucified. So that would have exalted James, but they didn't. They called James the brother of Jesus, the brother of the Messiah. And so as a historian, I am forced to say, when I look at the rise of early Christianity and why it took the shape it did, there are all sorts of things which make me say, I cannot actually explain how Christianity got going as a renewal movement in Judaism in the first century, and why it took this specific shape, unless they really all did believe that Jesus was really bodily raised from the dead.